Hey everybody, my name's Alex, and this is Bento Radio. Now before we get started, the usual stuff to get out of the way. First, if you really like the show, be sure to subscribe to it wherever you're getting it. If you're getting it on YouTube, be sure to scroll down and hit the like button, the subscribe button, and the bell, so you'll be notified when new episodes drop. That is usually about 7 p.m. Eastern Time, and those drop everywhere. And if you are listening to this podcast, you can subscribe to me in your favorite podcast app of choice. Basically, if you're hearing me or seeing me, you can go subscribe. And if you would be so kind, if you're listening to me, to leave the podcast a 5-star review if your platform of choice so allows that. It really helps the show. And, of course, you tell your friends, share it, all that stuff. But on that note, another thing I want to touch on here is if you absolutely love the podcast and can't get enough of what I'm doing here, you can go over to bento.ghost.io, and there are a bunch of posts for a bunch of episodes. I'm, as usual, behind because I'm only one man. But there's a bunch of posts for a bunch of the episodes. There are stories that I've done on anime, like essays that I've written about anime and cultural things around that. I've also put up I also still have up the previous year's Anime NYC coverage, so go look at that if you're interested in that. And the last goodie that's there actually is a beta testing link for my iOS app, which I've been working on and off on for a while, and I hope I can get it out soon. But in the meantime, you can still go use it. The idea is basically, what if an anime watch list app also let you take notes and think critically about what you're watching as you're watching it. So you can not only keep track of the shows you're watching, but you can also take notes on every single episode. You can also take just quick notes on different ideas that you have just around anime in general. My idea here was to build essentially a kind of critical thinking toolbox that I would want as somebody who makes this show for you to consume every week. So definitely go check that out once again over at the site, which is bento-box.ghost.io. That link is everywhere you could want it. It's in the description of this show. It's in the description of the YouTube channel. It's in the description of the podcast, wherever you're listening to the podcast, in both the episode description and the overall description. So definitely go check all that stuff out on there. And now, without further ado, let's jump into what we're talking about this week, and that's a little show from, I think, a while ago. Maybe 2016, but don't quote me on that. And that's a show called Monster Musume. Now, let's throw it over to Ai so she can give us a plot description. Ai, take it away.
Monster Musume, Everyday Life with Monster Girls, is about Kimihito Kurusu, an ordinary young man who ends up hosting several monster girls after Japan begins a cultural exchange program with mythical species. What starts as a bureaucratic mix-up turns into a chaotic household filled with lamias, harpies, centaurs, mermaids, and other non-human girls, all trying to adjust to modern human society. As they live together, the series mixes romantic comedy, domestic misunderstandings, and constant culture clash humor. Under all the fan service and chaos, the story is really about coexistence. Each girl has her own personality, insecurities, and struggles with fitting into a world built for humans, while Kimihito keeps getting dragged into increasingly absurd situations as he tries to care for everyone without breaking the law or his own sanity. The result is a harem comedy with a monster girl gimmick, but also a light theme of acceptance and cross-cultural living.
Now that the plot description's out of the way, let's jump into this, because there's something at my best I hope I do with anything I talk about on this show, and that is any show or movie or whatever I talk about on this podcast, and that is that I use the real world to help understand what's happening in the show itself. I know that sounds really basic, but in a show like Frieren that's very much focused on lost love and friendship and all that stuff, it can seem very obvious, but the reason why I'm talking about Monster Musume is not just to talk about Monster Musume this episode. Actually, to talk about, kind of quietly, I still reserve the right to talk about any other show in this genre. It's to talk about a genre of shows, and that genre of shows is a genre of shows called Monster Girl that I think of as Monster Girl anime. And with some notable exceptions, chief among them being interspecies reviewers, because that is a Monster Girl anime no matter which way you slice it. Monster Girl shows are about, in my mind, and this is my reading, it's not necessarily the reading that they give for explicitly in any of these shows, although they get pretty close in most of them, actually. It feels like it's a framework for talking about disability, and talking about disability in relations to everyone else in the world. And to talk about that, we are going to talk about Monster Musume, but I'm actually going to start with a different show, and that's a show called Interviews with Monster Girls. And this show essentially boils down to a high school teacher who wants to write an anthropology thesis paper on demi-humans and ends up interviewing his own students who, because it's anime, are, of course, all teenage girls who are also demi-humans. You have, I believe, a vampire, a Duhalin, a Yuki Ono, which is an ice woman. And the succubus she's a different thing, but you have the main three, I think, are the vampire girl, the Duhalin girl, and the Yuki Ono girl. But the succubus is actually a teacher, and that's meant to be a gag, but also not a gag. And the more you see this poor teacher, the more you realize they could have treated her like a gag, and they do at times, but they don't really. It's more tragic. I won't spoil that entirely, but suffice to say, it becomes this exploration of how these individual people go through the world in very different ways than anybody around them, because they are fundamentally, physically different in ways that no one else is. The Duhalin girl, her head can be fully separate from her body. The vampire girl gets a monthly allotment of blood from the government as her food source, as her technical source. The teacher who's a succubus is the best example, because she is a succubus. You can't be near people, really. And so she super late so she can take the last and empty train home. She gets to work super early so she can take the first and empty train to work. And she lives out in the middle. She lives way farther out than you would need to, because she doesn't want to be around people, because if she's around people and people sleeping in certain radius of her at night, they'll just get weird dreams. And she ends up having this kind of herself as a problem, almost, which is really fascinating and nightmarish. And like I said, much more tragic than they could have handled it. But that's that show, and I'm here to talk about Monster Musume because, for a very specific reason, and that's more than any of the Monster Girl shows, of which there are a bunch. Off the top of my head, I can name three. I can name Interviews with Monster Girl Doctor, Girl Doctor, and this one, Monster Musume. The idea behind Monster Musume is that basically the world of demi-humans was discovered at some point and then slowly began to integrate with humans. And so a governmental agency in Japan is facilitating this and basically placing demi-humans with human hosts or host families, depending, and helping cultured mix responsibly, essentially. I'm not going to quibble with this, and this is true of a lot of the Monster Girl shows. Even something exception of Interview with Monster Girl. So if you wanted the kind of ecchi lewdness of it, I would suggest you at least start there. A good, wholesome series, even though, tiding between the two adult characters doesn't go too crazy. But most of the Monster Girl shows are also ecchi shows. It's just the way they are. They're a certain kind of ecchi show that still exists and is, I think, that aspect of it actually helps. And to demonstrate that, I want to a little bit about the kind of window isn't the right term here, but it's something like the Overton window. It's I guess you could call it the current norm of the internet is to a certain kind of speech and talking about things in a certain way, because you don't want to trip anything that would drastically lower your views. It's commonly referred to as algo speak. but it also means that, like, it doesn't just mean algo speak, like tags instead of the real word. It means that you're not talking about things. For example, many people, less than did, but still so many people trip over themselves trying to talk about things like Rurouni Kenshin author is not okay. Like, stuff like that. Even I'm doing it now, and but I'm doing it for a purpose here. I'm doing it to kind of do what it looks and sounds like. But in that limiting factor, you can find real great things. Matthew Weiner, the created Mad Men, originally pitched Mad Men to HBO because he looked at what he made and he thought this is a good fit for HBO. And HBO said no. But the television channel, AMC, said yes. And AMC would later say yes to Mad, and they are considered to be one of the TV era of television. But what he said later was, it was kind of a blessing that HBO said no. Because if HBO said yes, then he would have been able to shoot all the sex scenes, shoot all the, detail that he had planned. Whereas in AMC, and he's on the record in an interview saying this, the sex in Mad Men became less about the sex scene and more about the aftermath of what happens after. And that's a really interesting concept in, when we make TV, but there's a limit to that. And oftentimes that limit is talking about things that make people uncomfortable and, things that not most shows explore. And in the kind of girl genre, especially Monster Musume, the show's doing is primarily an ecchi thing. It's a joke an episode. They have a, egg-laying scene with Poppy, the, character that's, uncomfortable. And it's meant to make you feel uncomfortable, and the main character, I think his actual name is Kazuhito, but the entire show calls him Darling. This is the kind of ecchi show that very much doesn't want you to think the main character is like a real dude, although hilariously, I'll get into it in a second, he comes off as a better dude than lots of people would be. For that, in the, where Poppy is laying an egg, and he defends her right to privacy from a weirdo, pervy documentarian. And in the setup, it is essentially the government is paying a bunch of people, but in particular, to take in kind of girl homestays, demi-human homestays, but you only ever see, because of the show, you only ever see female homestays in this show. Although with Arachne, they do get into all of the not all of the demi-humans are the idealized version of what demi-humans should be, and they get into that in a way that's brutal, I would say. But we'll get to that in a second. But essentially, the course of the show, Darling house is remodeled multiple times, and every time it's remodeled, something is majorly changed. In the case of, I think her name's Mia, I think it's pronounced Mia actually, is a lamia, meaning a snake lady, and with top half woman, bottom half snake. And what they do to his house is essentially they make the entire thing farther spaced out by 20 feet or so, because that's the traveling length of her tail. So she's not built, and you see this later with a Centaur character named Centaura, because the show likes to be very on the nose sometimes. The certain demi-humans don't have the same clearance requirements as humans. They have clearance requirements kind of close to a person in a wheelchair very often. Or even bigger, in the case of Centaura. And so what the government comes in and does to Kazuhito's house is essentially they bring it up to ADA code for lamias, which is a thing that happens constantly throughout the entire show as long as they're adding new cast members. And this is pretty subtextual until you get to the mermaid character. And the mermaid character is where it just starts being like, yo, all these girls are disabled. All of these demi-human characters are very much stand-ins for disabled characters. And if you're not getting that, we're going to put a mermaid in a wheelchair for you, and you're just going to have to deal with the fact that the main character, the standing character who's supposed to clearly be you, an idealized version of you in this scenario, is pushing around a girl in a wheelchair all the time. And granted, this was before something like Josie the Tiger and the Fish, which is an excellent anime movie about disability and about disability not being a limiting factor in how people perceive someone, which I think is important in this show, and we'll get to in a second. But the long and short of it is that once they introduce Marrow, the only place that Marrow is a fully real-life person is in water. So her room is essentially, like, it's got a visitor deck, but it's essentially a giant pool. Mia never sleeps in her room. She usually sleeps with Darling. She sneaks into her room and sleeps with Darling. She is the reason the house is basically the size of the corner of the block. Because they basically eminent domained a bunch of property to build this house bigger so it could be of size for her. And once again, with every new cast member added, the government shows up and is like, hey, we're going to make a bunch of changes to your house now. Could you have a new person with weird requirements staying here? They do it for Centaura. Ultimately, the weirdest one they do, and listen, Sue, as a character, is a slime character who is just supposed to be underage. And like I said in the beginning, this show is absolutely an ecchi show. It absolutely has all the ecchi things going for it. Trust me. But once you get past that, and you look at what, like I said, once the show is doing in terms of talking about disability, and treating it a little bit like a joke, but also recognizing that, the world just isn't built for a centaur lady. The world isn't super built for a woman who, instead of having legs, has a 20-foot-long tail. Or in the case of frickin' Poppy, who can't hold ice cream. She wanted to get ice cream, and Kabuhito had to hold her ice cream cone, and they made a joke about that, because of course they did. But that's like a real thing. It's like a thing that you can see a disabled person being just wanting help with something above and beyond what just being frustrated. No, I can't hold this, or I can't do this. I need your help for this. And as a disabled person myself, I do know that. Although I am almost painfully self-reliant on some level. Most of my friends wait until I get frustrated and I'll start grunting and they're like, hey bud, do you want some help? I'm like, fine. But a lot of the show is gags around monster girls being monster girls. And that becomes gags around the world not being built for the physical bodies they have. The fact that Poppy has no hands. Or the fact that, once again, Mia is 20 feet long. Or Centaura is just a horse. It's just like a lady stuck on top of a horse. Later you get a Duhallen character whose head just goes missing. But the thing I want to talk about with Sue is interesting because she's a slime girl, essentially. And that means she can't go out in the rain. And that's where that's where this show starts to be even more interesting, because up until Marrow, you have a cast of characters who are still relatively capable. They can make do out in the normal world. The Kabuhito's house is completely modified for each of them, but they can all get by. And then you encounter Marrow, who is essentially wheelchair-bound outside of water, which is most of the time. And then you encounter Sue. And Sue is one of the last characters that they add on to the show. I think it's Sue, and then they add on to the show. There's significantly more characters you encounter in the manga, and I'll get into the manga in a little bit, because I want to talk about, I forget what their abbreviation is, the Mon Squad, the task force that deals with demi-human-related crimes and stuff, because we'll get to that in a second. But with Sue, what they're doing is they're saying this character has a very specific thing that can't happen to them, and that is she can't go into large bodies of water. She can, but she'll dilute so much that she will essentially just, she can be flushed down the drain if that happens. And there's a couple scenes where it's pouring rain out and everybody, where the hell is Sue? Because if she gets caught in the rain, it'll be decades before anybody finds her, if ever. And that's not good. and consideration there, and the understanding there, and the awareness of what that is very close to something of somebody with somebody like, say, Iron Mouse, for example. Somebody who has a severe disease that doesn't allow them to go out and interact with people in a normal way. There has to be consideration taken there. And that consideration is demonstrated through Sue's over-integrative abilities with water because she is a slime. And here's where I want to switch over to the manga a little bit, because I want to talk about the On Squad, which you see primarily in the show as the end credits roll, because they show this smash cut of the Mon Squad, which is this task force of demi-human women who are explicitly monsters, not in the way that you think of mythological. Up until, for most of the main cast, you see mythological things. Mermaids, lamias, centaurs, slimes, harpies, Dewholland. I think that's literally all of them. But the Mon Squad are a zombie woman, a cyclops woman, and an ogre woman. And the ogre woman is essentially a big lady with a horn. The zombie lady is literally a zombie lady, and they do a ton of great gags with just the fact that her parts pop off. And she's technically undead, so unless you shoot her in the head, you can shoot her as much as you want. Nothing bad's gonna happen to her. The Cyclops girl is a tiny girl with one giant eye, which is always hilarious. But in that vein, they are a task force that deals with demi-human related crimes and disturbances. And there's this moment in there where they encounter these ogres, not trolls either. They encounter these orcs. And these orcs are essentially causing a disturbance. But the reason they're causing a disturbance is because they aren't socially accepted by anybody. And a really interesting thing for me, as a disabled guy who moves through the world, there are anything else, classes of disability, and ways you feel for somebody or you don't. I'm what you would consider to be incredibly high functioning in terms of my disability. It exists, but it does not meaningfully impede me in any way. And very often, you don't see very much media about that that's overwhelmingly positive, but you see a lot of media about disabled women that's overwhelmingly positive. You see a lot of media about disabled women that is sympathetic towards the disabled characters. Even in something like Full Metal Alchemist, the most held at an sympathy level isn't really Ed or Al. It's Panina from Rust Valley. She's one of the first characters they show her in a way that is sympathetic. And when they show Ed and Al and the fact that Ed ripped his own body apart and sealed his brother inside of a suit of armor, it's seen as a tragedy, but they move on from it really quickly. It is their tragedy and they hold it and they move forward with it. But with Panina, I don't think his name is Isaac, I think it might be Isaac, the old automail guy. He picks her body up and making you new limbs, kid, blah, blah. And that's really sympathetic in a way that isn't paid towards any of the other disabled characters in the show, necessarily, and I'm sure people will argue that in the comments. But it strikes me that Ed is the main character and a male character, but Panina is a side character, yes, but she's also a female disabled character in that show, and the show instantly treats it differently. And you see that with the orcs here. The orcs are like your standard giant, obese, pig-faced, giant tusk orc guys. The thing they're pissed about is the fact that all of the demi-human outreach, all of the demi-human foster home placement stuff is about helping essentially young, attractive, in some way, shape, or form, even Arachne, who we'll get to in a second, women be placed with families in Japan. The male versions of that, the less attractive versions of that, just don't get placement. They never stood a chance. And in concert with that, you look at the Mon Squad, the monster girls who are maintaining order, and once again you have an ogre woman, a zombie lady, and a Cyclops girl. And so they're also horrifying in their own ways. So government character, I forget her name, gets to them in time and makes them a spec ops unit, essentially. And so they have some independence and authority. Whereas these poor orc guys never got a chance. And I know I'm reading tons into a gag here, and a gag is supposed to be gross because I think they're also, the reason why they want to stay in Japan is because they want to go to handshake events for idols or something completely bizarre and slightly grody. But the point still stands that all of the demi-human characters you encounter in this show, aside from the orc guys, are cute girls. They are They are designed specifically to make you feel bad for them when Centaura can't fit through an automatic door for a grocery store. When Marrow can't exist outside, needs a wheelchair outside of water. When Poppy can't hold ice cream, for God's sake. There's a common understanding about manga artists. And that is, a lot of manga artists tell on themselves in their own stories. And that is because manga artists have complete control of everything in their stories. Yes, if they make enough wrong turns, it will stop being serialized and the thing will be canceled. Or an editor will suggest something, like an editor suggested the Cell Saga in Dragon Ball Z. But by and large, especially visually, the authors have complete control. And so what you're seeing there is every visual thing you see in a show is a specific choice. You see in a manga is a specific choice. In ecchi and arrow manga, that becomes immediately clear and super stark. In either of those kinds of manga, you're seeing the author play on fetishes, play on personal preferences, play on preferences that are popular, play to an audience or play away from an audience, what have you. But in shows that are outwardly less dedicated to that stuff, it still exists. So, thing that I've heard a couple times is that One Piece is very sex positive. And I think that's wrong, because probably the most sex positive show I've ever seen is, it's actually partially Goblin Reincarnation, but I've talked about that show 900 times. But the other show, Interspecies Reviewers, doesn't steer away from that. It steers directly into it, and it's just a bunch of guys having really honest, frank conversations, and one girl having really honest, frank conversations about sex. Going to brothels and reviewing them, and having honest conversations about their own preferences, and in a way that's really frank and not lampshaded ever. To me, that's what how you make a sex-positive anime. The way you don't do it is by allowing characters to objectify themselves, because that sentence is an insane sentence. Allowing a character in a story to objectify themselves is not a thing that's possible, because people get attached to the characters that people write. Happens all the time. Happened to me. I'm sure it's happened to you. But the thing you should always remember is that there's somebody behind that character writing that thing. So you're not experiencing somebody who's a fully formed person. You're experiencing somebody who's being made in front of your eyes constantly. And every choice that you're seeing is not that character's choice, because that character has no choices. The character, I know this sounds super basic, but that character is not real. Will never be. This is also true, with the exception of based on or documentary style stuff. Characters in movies, like Danny Ocean from the Ocean's 11 movies, isn't real. Maybe based on a bunch of real people, but it isn't like a person you could go out and meet George Clooney. George Clooney could assume the role of Danny Ocean and have a conversation with you, but Danny Ocean as a human does not exist. All the things that he does are choices made by the actor and writers and director of the movies that character appears in. That is true of specifically the thing I always think of is One Piece, because I was like, it didn't alarm me so much as it caught me off guard, the way they treated the female cast members of One Piece post-time skip. Because you went from having Nami be a pretty sporty teenage girl to being fully in a bikini all the time. you see, and people will argue that Zoro never has a shirt on. Frankie, it's always barely buttons his shirt, and I get it. But what I'm trying to say is that every time you watch something, you should be aware that someone's making all of the choices that your characters are being perceived to have made. And you can treat those characters like real people, but they don't exist. And their actions are being dictated by someone else. So you're not necessarily getting somebody telling on themselves all the time, although that is oftentimes what almost accidentally happens. You're getting someone's takes and arguments and interpretations of things given to you through character representations. A great example of this, and then I'll get back to why I'm talking about this way. A great example of this is in the last season of anime, episode of Fire Force that starts with the explanation of the cataclysm, and it starts in media res, and you're seeing a real person. And actually, I think it's the voice actor for Maki. And then it proceeds to have it basically proceeds to tell the viewers off of, screw you if you don't like what I'm doing with this character. Screw you if you don't like that I'm doing this lucky lecture gag, essentially. And Obata, the mangaka behind Fire Force, did that also with Blair and Soul Eater. But what he's doing there is he's addressing the audience, because the audience sees that character, and not Maki, but the Fire Cat Girl character, who always falls out of her own clothes. That was his turning that dial up too high, in many cases, for many viewers. Because they're seeing past the idea that she's a character, and more that she's a tool for the show to make gross jokes with. And in that case, they decoupled the character from her own mannerisms and let the audience go through the middle of that to get at him, the author. And he clearly got enough hate where, we're writing a thing about this. We're screaming at the audience right now. And in Monster Musume, I would be a bit surprised to find out that I forget the author's name, was thinking about a lot of things about disability and things about accessibility and acceptability, because that stuff is weaved all the way through this show, constantly. Even before we get the ogres, actually, I think after we get Arachne. And Arachne is the hot spider lady who is a breakout hit from this property. Almost more than any other character, because she's a hot spider lady who's into being a hot spider lady and into tying people up and being explicitly erotic about it. And hilariously, to the show, Kazuhito, the main character, what's supposed to be the blank space where you can insert yourself in, they accidentally give him just too much personality. They make him too much of a guy. He's not milquetoast enough for you to feel like you're watching the bald, faceless guy from Arrow Anime that you can paste yourself over in your brain. And with Arachne's character introduction, they fully just turned the dial up on the Kazuhito needs to have a personality, he needs to be really into this lady. Explicitly into this lady in a real meaningful, validating way. And you find Arachne with her host family, and her host family is simultaneously terrified of her, but also keeping her as a way to get the money from the state. And it essentially turns into a weird hostage crisis. And Kazuhito ends up diffusing it and being like, actually I think your late legs are kind of sexy as hell. And she's like, oh, I'm into you too now. But, as with the orc, because she is a demi-human, that is a thing that is so recognizably terrifying for people, people are inherently scared of her. And once the show gives her a place to be, she is comfortable. She's comfortable. She messes with Kazuhito all the time, and Kazuhito is fine with it. They have bondage play sessions, and he enthusiastically participates. And he participates and meets every single one of the harem cast members where they're at, which is a really cool thing to see, because he totally understands that Sue is a child, so he meets Sue at that level. He meets Mia at the weird, sycophantic, obsessive level she's at. Meets Centaur. He has meaningful relationships with all the characters, and the dynamic there that feels at least a little evolved at worst, but truly evolved at best from something what is truly this thing's ancestral hub, which is Love Hina. This thing feels like Love Hina with Monster Girls in a real way. But like I said, the thing with Arachne is acceptance and social acceptance and visual straight up understanding is rearing its head in this show again. And I really, whenever I bring this idea up, that all Monster Girl shows are about exploring disability, everybody pushes back on me at first. And then as soon as I'm like, but in most of the shows, but at least 3 of the major shows, of which there are a lot, but not many, it's certainly like out of a subgenre, are about exploring the physicality of being different in the world, of being a different version of what could pass for human in the world. Once again, 20-foot long snake lady, giant horsewoman, giant spider lady with 8 legs, tiny girl who is a slime but who cannot go out in the rain because she will just dissolve into 9 zillion particles. The more I bring that up, the more people are like, oh, maybe he's right. Maybe this is the way you can read all these shows. And I think the reading's totally fair. But that's where I'm going to leave it this time, so...
Hey, I hope you enjoyed the podcast, and if you did, be sure to subscribe wherever you're listening or watching. If you're listening to it on a podcast platform and they allow you to give a 5-star review, be sure to do that. If you're watching this on YouTube and you really liked what you saw, be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel and like the video. In addition, if you want to make sure that you don't miss a beat, be sure to hit that notification bell so you know when new episodes drop. But if you're wondering, they drop every Thursday night Eastern time. And on that note, if you really love the podcast, and you really love what I'm trying to do here, be sure to give the website a look. That website is bento-box.ghost.io. There will be a link in the description of either this podcast or this video. It'll also be linked in the description of the entire podcast on the information page. It'll also be linked in the description of the YouTube channel. So there's plenty of ways for you to get to that website and check it out. If you want to follow me, my social links are also listed in the footer of that page. So once again, go over there to find that stuff. But I hope you liked the episode. I look forward to talking to you next time. But until next time, I have been Alex. This has been Bento Radio, and I'll talk at you later.